I'm not an activist. Those were the words of Sherry Good, the Toronto woman who launched a class action lawsuit against the Toronto police force after the G20 summit here in 2010. Along with about 1,000 other innocent people, Sherry was caught up in what remains the largest mass arrest in Toronto's history. The song I just sang was inspired by that event, but I've been told that it comments on many people's experiences of first-time activism. In the past year, many women and men have come to protest, to march in the streets as they did yesterday, and every day more people come to social justice work because they see abuse of power up close. Before living through an experience of victimization or witnessing injustice against others up close, we might not tend to raise our voice. We might feel unaware of social justice issues, perhaps typically unpolitical, only standing there. But that can change. After I wrote that song, I discovered a book by Thomas Merton, the late Christian mystic and activist. It was called Confessions of a Guilty Bystander, a title that I think comments on the position of the reluctant prophet. When we engage in life fully, allowing the opening of our eyes, as described in David Whyte's poem, we cannot help but see and indeed experience injustice. And in that blaze of realization, the revelation that something is burning that we did not expect nor want to be, we might be called, if not dragged, into the role of prophet. In biblical times, more than 2,000 years ago, prophets were said to be ordinary people who were called by God to speak a truth that challenged the social order. Moses was a prophet called to lead his people out of Egypt. Jonah was a very famous reluctant prophet called by God to preach to a particular community, but at first running away from that responsibility. Jesus was a prophet called to critique his faith tradition and to reimagine it according to a message of unconditional love. Muhammad was a prophet called by God to carry forward the teachings of previous prophets, including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. In the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah was a prophet called by God to spiritually unify the world. Some might even say that Gautama Buddha was a prophet of sorts, although of course he did not claim any such title. One could say that he was called by a transformative, non-theistic experience to live in a more compassionate way and to teach others to do so. There are many other historical prophets we could mention, and of course there were and are many self-described prophets in both the religious and secular worlds who, blessedly, do not have a lasting influence. And there are many effective and inspiring prophets who speak to smaller groups or for shorter periods of time, who never become well known. In the Unitarian faith tradition, guided by our fourth principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, we hold the sacred responsibility of deciding who, for us, is a prophet and who is not. We also have the invitation, and indeed, I think the responsibility, to nurture the prophet within, so that we might be voices for social justice in our own time and in our own way. As the philosopher Friedrich Schlegel once said, the historian is a prophet looking backwards. Whenever someone speaks truth to power or challenges the way things are in hopes of creating a better world, they, or we, don't really know how the story is going to turn out. The act of calling forth a new way of being, it's an act of faith. Where the ancient religious prophets were called by God, we might feel called perhaps by the creative unfolding toward good, or pulled perhaps along that arc of the universe that is bending toward justice, the one that our Unitarian ancestor Theodore Parker and later Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of so eloquently. In his book, The Prophetic Imperative, Unitarian Universalist theologian Richard S. Gilbert writes about an ongoing force he calls cosmic creativity, a creative process that prompts him to work at repairing the world while I may. Gilbert says, "This power speaks to me from people of prophetic fire, a creative minority who believe they can change the world. It speaks to me from the lives of ordinary men and women and children, and from the depths of my own heart, when I pause long enough and thoughtfully enough to hear and heed." In our times, when God can be reimagined as the universal creative power, the voice within, the deep self, or when life itself can take the place of any concept of God, ordinary people are called to be prophets all the time. That said, the stories of the ancient prophets can shed light on our own stumbling toward prophecy, as can the examples of well-known prophets in the modern day who can serve as an inspiration to us. One thing is sure, to be a prophet can be unprofitable, to say the least. On January 15th, millions of people around the world honored the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a prophet who was killed as a result of his activism, as of course were Oscar Romero of El Salvador, Dietrich Bonhoeffer executed by the Nazis, and many others. Malala Yousafzai's activism did not begin with the attempt on her life, but it has been intensified by it. And many environmental prophets today, such as Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, and David Suzuki, have attracted more than their share of ridicule and rejection from the powerful mainstream. When people challenge the social or religious order of the times, they often put themselves in unpopular or dangerous positions. Conversely, when we are comfortable or even profiting from our place in the world as it is, well, how can we live into a truly prophetic role? Prophecy and prophet can be a contradiction in terms. In order to be able to offer genuine prophetic witness, we have to be willing to undergo radical change within ourselves so that we can step forward fearlessly, knowing that whatever we might need to give up, like the jewel in Mike's story this morning, is less important than the well-being of the whole. I can tell you that I'm only at the beginning of that road of transformation myself, and I fall short of my ideals more often than I'd like to admit. But admitting that, as Thomas Merton did as the self-described guilty bystander, may be the first step toward genuine change. When I was in my late 20s, I experimented with prophetic action on a very small scale, when I was moved to act on what I saw as an injustice taking place in my neighborhood. In a relatively safe act of political writing, I wrote a facts and arguments story for the Globe and Mail. Although I changed the names in the story, people on our street recognized themselves, and they were very, very angry. It was, for me, a small taste of the unpopularity that prophets can experience. Although I'd like to say that I easily withstood the criticism and continued to speak out with confidence and courage, that was not actually the case. I withdrew from any kind of political writing for quite some time. I had to grow into my ability to speak up. Today, as a result of spiritual practice, self-reflection, and dialogue in community, I hope that I've matured into a more grounded and confident sense of my own ethics. As a Unitarian Universalist, I'm encouraged to stand up for my principles while recognizing that other people may have different views, and to understand that conflict can lead to growth and change and is therefore not something that needs to be feared. I'm still finding my feet in all of this, and also finding the prophetic voice that best suits me. I'm reminded of the Jewish wisdom story about Rabbi Zuzia. He said, "When I meet God in heaven, he will not ask me, 'Why were you not Moses?' He will ask me, 'Why were you not Zuzia?'" What then is the kind of prophet you are called to be, according to your understanding of a greater good? It seems to me that making a prophet, or fulfilling our prophetic potential, depends as much on the inner process of opening and awakening as it does on external activities. It may be that, like the reluctant prophet Jonah, we need to go deep into the metaphorical belly of the whale in order to release some of our ego concerns and our perceived needs for approval and comfort, so that we might risk more for a higher cause. When we've spent some time in the darkness, been confronted by injustice or, dare I say, evil, when we've gotten up close to the suffering of others and the suffering of the earth, we might be transformed by that experience. We might find that something in me's changed somehow. I wasn't then what I am now. As much as the growth toward prophetic potential is an individual journey, though, it all depends on relationship. It's about standing with others in their sorrow and pain, about acknowledging our own doubts, fears, and longings, and then joining together in the urgent work of prophetic witness. In his well-known essay, The Prophethood of All Believers, the Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams wrote, "The prophetic liberal church is not a church in which the prophetic function is assigned merely to the few. It is the church in which all members share the common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, both individual and institutional, with the intention of making history in place of merely being pushed around by it." A recent article in UU World magazine asked whether all Unitarians must be activists in light of the current discussions of race relations and white supremacy currently taking place at the Unitarian Universalist Association. It's an article well worth reading. There's a wide spectrum of views there from key leaders in the UU movement today. In addition to their question, do you have to be an activist to be a UU, which I fear could be misinterpreted as who's in and who's out, I find myself wanting to ask additional questions, such as, how can we become the sort of people who are truly prophetic, whether through protest, poetry, or political action? How can we become stronger in our convictions that the world can change for the better and express that conviction in ways that guide and lead? How can we be an embodiment of whatever creative good called forth the prophecy in the first place? A clue might be found in the first hymn we sang today, "Though I May Speak with Bravest Fire." It's based on the text of 1 Corinthians 13, one of Paul's letters from the Christian New Testament. "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains but have not love, I am nothing." When we ask ourselves, to what work of justice are we genuinely and urgently called, both as individuals and as a congregation, we might start with the very simple question, how shall we love? Questions like these require us to look deeply within, according to our own understandings of what is good and right and true. And that is always an emerging understanding, and I would say an imperfect one. There are no easy answers in this, but through the process of difficult discernment, we might find ourselves at last on solid ground, rooted in what is real and necessary, rooted in the deep self, in soul, in life, in beloved community, or in God. We might find ourselves changed in the ways that allow us to change the world, and burning with the creative fire that created us in the first place. I believe that is what life wishes for us. May it be so.